Right, very good. Good morning, dearest friends. Tuesday, September 6th, the 10th of Elul. Shocking even to hear that date come out of my mouth. Time is flying, Baruch Hashem. But we're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. And we are making some marked progress in our journey through the Talmud. We are now studying Masechet Shabbat, chapter 19, page 133a, Kuf Lamed Gimel, Gematria Kellogg, in case we need to remember that. And we are winding down a lengthy Mishnah talking about circumcision on Shabbos. Well, we're not done talking about circumcision on Shabbos. We're winding down this solid week-long segment, which has been to go back to the sources, back to the psukim, and understand why sometimes one mitzvah takes priority over the other. Namely, or for the most part, why is it that a bris would push aside Shabbos? Generally, you can't circumcise. If circumcision was not a mitzvah, you wouldn't be allowed to do those activities on Shabbos, and yet a bris happens on Shabbos. And so we waded and waded through different psukim. We then went on to analyze other such questions with a similar frame, in a similar style. And so we were also probing why saras would be pushed aside for circumcision. And we are actually in the tail end of that discussion. If you recall, at the very end of yesterday's Gemara, we said that a Rav and Abaye had a disagreement if Mila Bismana, if a timely bris pushes aside circumcision, if that idea is deduced logically or from a pasuk. And then we quoted a brisa that says, actually, this opinion is reflected already in the brisa. We then, and this is where we closed out, we got into an old discussion, the discussion about Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Huda, about when you do an act, but it's entirely not your intention. So usually we talk about Shabbos, doing an act, doing something that triggers a result that is akin to a malacha, but your desire is not for the malacha. Is it prohibited or permitted? Well, it's not your kavanah, but it is your action. And so Rabbi Shimon says, it's all about kavanah. And Dr. Hammer agrees. It's all about kavanah.
Absolutely.
Buddha says, no. Many times, even if it's not your intention, we look at your actions. Actions speak louder than words, and so it would be prohibited. But then we have a consensus. Although Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon argue most vigorously and frequently, in a case of psik reisha v'layamos, where there is absolutely no chance in the world that it's not going to be the malacha, or the end result is absolutely going to happen, kind of like the way you cut off a chicken's head and the chicken dies, and there's no such thing as cutting off a chicken's head and the chicken does not die. Well, there are other such activities. For example, cutting off a foreskin with a spot of leprosy. There's no question that if you cut off the foreskin and upon the foreskin is a baheres, it's most certainly going to be removed. And so the question is going to start to become proportions of intention or whatever. So this might sound familiar because we're finally seeing the marriage, the fusion of two different kinds of conversations among many that we've had in our Gemara. And then today we'll wade through that in a pretty fast pace. And the Ezer Hashem, by the end of today, we'll be up to the next Mishnah. Please, Hashem, will be up to the next Mishnah, which will be a nice milestone and accomplishment for us. Before we jump into the Gemara and I share the screen, Dr. Stalman, I don't know if you saw, I shared a link on the Chabura about a recent archaeological find of ivory from the First Temple era.
Yes, and I saw it.
It's actually from our
other places afterwards, but very nice. And
it's from our very favorite site, Ir David, and the Givati parking lot. The interesting thing, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this, is I was in Israel probably 13, 14 years ago. And at that time, they had just begun excavating the Givati parking lot. And I remember them saying that although it's highly improbable, they may find something interesting here. And so they're engaging in a dig. And then for my brother's wedding, I went back to Israel 4 or 5 years ago. And at that point, they had excavated a Hasmonean era palace or mansion, and they had found actually an earring that was very reminiscent to the style of what the Mishnah describes in the Kohen, and there was discussions, was this style, and they also found a very, very beautiful, exquisite jewelry, which they believed, and they had come to the conclusion that this home, this structure, may have been, and it's when you need to sell archaeology, you got to talk up the may have beens, and so they say it may have been a famous Queen Helene from an African region who had a residence in Israel, and her sons, and she was very close to the Beis Hamikdash and to the leadership in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash during the Hasmonean dynasty, and I thought, wow, who would have ever imagined the first time I was there that they would uncover this structure? But they were beginning then to do additional, and now to read that underneath that they're finding ivory decoration from a first temple era home is absolutely astounding. And again, this is totally not on the topic of Talmud, but I know we have folks here that share my excitement for the matter. So anyways, I posted it there, and there's going to be an exhibition and videos online, I'm sure, and so it's something to keep an eye out for. And it's very exciting to think of one Givati parking lot right outside of the old, or relatively outside of the old city, just above, what's the Arab village called, with a Q, or the well, anyways, so that's pretty cool. Aswan, I think they called, right?
Yeah. Silwan?
I'm sorry, Doc?
Is that Silwan?
Silwan, I'm sorry, Silwan, yes. And actually, Silwan is the Arabic for Shiloach, I believe. And so it's for that region. That's the location of the Silwan spring or whatever, the Shiloach. Yes. All righty, let's now jump into the Gemara. I'm going to just repeat just a tad. I'm just going to show you this really fast. You have here Abaya and Rava arguing if we know that you push aside circumcision by logic, a kal v'chomer, or a pasuk, and then the Gemara ultimately says, Tanoihi, it's dependent on it's the subject of a machloikas of Tanoim, and so we have Rabbi Yoshia saying that we use the word basar to teach us that you remove a beheres, even though you cannot remove a leprous spot, but for circumcision you do. And Rabbi Yonasan says, Einei tzarech, use a kal v'chomer, use logic. We then asked, why are we talking about psukim at all? This is davar she'ein miskaven hu, davar she'ein miskaven mutar. If you're only intending to do the mitzvah of milah, and along the way you remove a baheres, a spot, who cares? That wasn't your intention. So Amar Abaya, here is how Abaya explains this brisa. You know why we need a pasuk. You know why we don't know it based on miskaven. This is really consistent with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar davar shemiskaven aser, because he says, I don't care that there's no kavana. If the act is the act, it's aser. And so according to Rabbi Yehuda, you need a pasuk to say that you could do it here. Because even though you don't have a kavana, Rabbi Yehuda says you would not be allowed to do it unless the Torah explicitly gives you a clue that you can. That is Abaya's take. Rava here is going to be more inclusive, and he's going to say no. Afilu Tema Rabbi Shimon, even Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, who are on two different sides of the spectrum of the Kavana wars, they will both agree here that had not the Torah taught us that you could remove the Arla and the Baheres, the Tzaras alongside it, I would not know that you could do it. Rava Amar Afilu Tema Rabbi Shimon, even if we're talking Rabbi Shimon here, Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Shimon agrees that in a case of psik reisha, it is absolutely going to happen, even if it's not your intent. The argument of not having intention only goes so far. And so in this circumstance, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, everyone agrees, if not for a pasuk, I would not let you do a bris if along the way a tzara'as spot got moved. So Rava expands the context, or he expands the meaning and the significance of the brisa telling us that you may remove saras alongside the circumcision. And no one, not Rabbi Shimon, not Rabbi Yehuda, would say that we don't need a pasuk. Everyone would agree here you need a pasuk. But now that we've said what we know, that Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda agree when it's psik ratio, when it's absolutely going to transpire? How could Abaye ever say otherwise? How could Abaye say Lo nitzrucha el Rabbi Yehuda, that only Rabbi Yehuda needs a pasuk to teach me that you could do the bris and remove the tsaras along the way? Doesn't he know that Rabbi Shimon agrees psik ratio? Was he missing in his class the day that they taught that? How could he ever assume otherwise? We know this so clearly. Ready for this?
Yeah.
The Abaye Leisley Haisvara. You're going to tell me Abaye does not agree with this? Maybe he doesn't accept the premise of psik ratio, according to Rabbi Shimon. Doctor?
What does this have to say about removing tsaras that is contiguous to the orla, but not part of it?
That might be a problem, or at least you probably need to go through the tsaras cleansing process before removing that spot. Usually you're not allowed to remove tsaras. You have to go through the proper process of healing. Here's the unique circumstance where the only way you can do the bris is to remove it, and we don't tell you to hold off. We tell you go ahead, do the bris.
I understand, but as you're cutting, right? And it's like a scab. Let's assume.
Oh, you want to know if you can just keep on cutting?
Yeah.
Does not seem that you could. It would have to be. It's a good question, but it would have to be. It would, the way I understand, and the Gemara is not going to say exactly your question, but the Gemara is going to wade into that territory. But it has to be that the Mohel is doing his job, like he always does. The Mohel doesn't maybe even realize there's saras. He's just doing his job, and in the process, he's removing it. If there's an extra cut or an extra, first of all, in general, when it comes to certain regions of the body, you can't really be very haphazard and callous about an extra cut. Extra cuts are very, not good, let's say. So, but assuming that it could work, that would not be allowed to be done, to my knowledge. The question really is, we have, again, I just want to repeat, it's not hard, but it's just a lot of different steps. The Brisa says that there's a pasuk that tells us you could do the bris procedure even if a tsaras comes up. The question is, was this Brisa necessary according to all of the rabbis of the Mishnah, or only the rabbis who say, I don't care about kavanah, it's still prohibited? So Abayas initially says it's only if you believe in kavanah, that no kavanah, that the kavanah, what's it called? The kavanah pleading doesn't get you off. But Rabbi Shimon would say, yeah, you didn't have kavanah. And then Rava says, hold on, it's psik ratio, here it's absolute. And so the Gemara now asks, Abaye leislei haisvara? Are you going to try to tell me Abaye disagrees about Rabbi Shimon and the psik ratio? We have Abaye and Rava agreeing, speaking out in unison in another context, and saying, Rabbi Shimon, so this is a matter of consensus. Abaye and Rava are on the same page, and all of a sudden here, Abaye seems deaf, unaware of the psik ratio v'lo yamos halacha. Ready for this? Here is a beautiful place in the Gemara. Basar deshama meirava savra. Abaye wasn't born thinking psik ratio v'lo yamos, you're not allowed to do it. Abaye went through a process of discovery and learning. And initially, Abaye did not read into the words of Rabbi Shimon that he would not let you plead kavana, lack of intent in a psik ratio. And eventually, Rava shared with Abaye the notion that it looks like Rabbi Shimon would not let you off the hook if it's psik ratio. And then after hearing it, Savra, he thought it through and accepted that as so. And so the Gemara here is recording that Abaye had a evolution. He went through a process of study, and he was convinced, and he bought on to Rava's understanding of Rabbi Shimon, so much so that later on, it's preserved as a joint, unanimous teaching of Abaye and Rava. But that wasn't always the case. A younger Abaye didn't see it. So that's a nice.
Rabbi,
Yes, doctor.
I'm still not comfortable with your answer to me for the continuation, because we understand Saras as being whatever we want to call it, okay?
Right.
But we know that we put off a bris for the color of the skin, for pretty lightweight kinds of medical conditions, okay? And so and a doctor is supposed to do no harm. So
Right.
if there was something going on there in that area, okay, if jaundice is enough to put it off, so you have some growth there, whatever we want to call it, the idea of going ahead with a bris and not having and saying, oh, his kavana is to do the bris, and anything else is really not important. It's not as his kavana to do anything else. Is not consistent with how we treat other conditions which push off a bris.
So here's how I understand it, and you'll tell me if you accept. It is certainly so that if a child would not be able to endure a bris without being healed, so there's a possible jeopardy to the child, we will push off the bris indefinitely. But that's because of the supreme value of pikuach nefesh, doicha kol haTorah. Of course, if the tsaras would be a pikuach nefesh situation, we would push off the bris.
Okay.
But the assumption, the way I understand the Gemara, and I believe the Gemara makes this assumption, we do not conceive this tsaras spot as life jeopardizing. It's simply a halachic question. Do we wait for it to heal, or do we remove it? And so the answer is, if it's on the arla, we don't delay for we don't delay a circumcision for almost any reason. Why only almost any reason? Why don't we say we don't delay it for any reason? Well, because we do delay it for pikuach nefesh. But as soon as the pikuach nefesh, which is the most chamor factor, as soon as that's not a factor, well then, bris has a priority in the hierarchy of different mitzvot, and it will push aside the saras. But that does not mean that we take lightly the notion of removing saras from the skin. And therefore, you can't remove anything other than what's swept up in the circumcision. You don't like what I just said?
No, because pikuach nefesh, the baby has a little fever, we push it off.
Yeah?
Pikuach nefesh, and you don't know what's going on with this, we'll call it a growth there, which extends beyond the orla. So I don't see it as a
So again, if that growth...
The way I look at it is, if you look at dermatological treatments, usually if you come to a dermatologist with a lesion,
right,
he does one of two things. Either he waits or gives you a cream to see if it goes away, or if he thinks it's worse, he'll remove it so it doesn't get any deeper.
Right.
So in that case, usually a blemish is not life-threatening immediately. It may be life-threatening in the long term, and in that case, you try to remove it so it doesn't get any deeper.
Okay.
So in that case, it wouldn't be pikuach nefesh, and the fact, and you remove it.
For the purposes of our Gemara, we need to stipulate
let me just one quick comment, Menachem. You left out one thing. If he suspects something, forget about the cream. If he suspects something, he takes a biopsy to rule out something, right?
He removes it, but basically you remove it.
Right. So you need that time. You need the
biopsy
time.
When you, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You need. I agree with you. Okay, but if the dermatologist suspects possibly that he doesn't know exactly what, and you're about to go through some form of an operation to make sure that you're safe, that there's a pikuach nefesh, they'll do a biopsy maybe, because you said in the long run it might be bad.
So we need to stipulate that a baheres is a kind of dermatological spot that is supremely not dangerous. And that has to be the situation we're talking about. It's purely or primarily a spiritual and religious concern.
Right.
Therefore, the discussion is religious. Again, if this was chas v'shalom, something that potentially put the child in jeopardy, and there was a dermatological concern, maybe this growth could get worse or cause harm, then certainly that would be another question worthy of discussion. But again, the whole Gemara here is premised that baheres was a kind of spot on the skin that didn't necessarily equal infection, although it could have. It didn't necessarily equal anything of great alarm. It was more like a discoloration that, absent the halachic issue, one might remove it. I would add just one more thing. Assuming that the spot is not a growth,
right?
You can't cut off every rash a person gets. I think that's the first thing that Dr. Stamler said. You put on a cream. And so even on the Arla, usually you put a cream, except for here, the whole skin is being removed. So you don't mind, but it's not really always so feasible just to cut off every rash you see. Many times to cut off the rash is to cut off, what's the saying? To cut off the arm, the nose to spite the face or something. To cut off a rash, it would just make the person a much more terrible and agonizing and lengthy healing process. And so I think we need to stipulate that our Gemara here is describing a dermatological event that is supremely not dangerous from a medical vantage point. Therefore, it is just about exclusively a halachic question. But, for example, jaundice or a fever, which is a global issue for the baby, and a baby at 8 days old is somewhat medically vulnerable. Therefore, the mohalim following halacha are extremely careful not to circumcise a baby that may have some kind of weakness. Again, but that all stems from pikuach nefesh and preserving the baby's wellness. We have to stipulate that this baheres is not reflective of any general weakening of the baby's condition, and it's purely a halachic question.
Rabbi?
Yes.
So if there is a danger to the health or to life of the baby, then the situation is clear.
Yes.
However, you mentioned that this is not a physical condition. There is no physical danger, but it's rather a spiritual condition. So what I hear here is that there is a danger to the baby in the spiritual area. And I would expect that it should be addressed, that this is the child is born with this spiritual malady, and there exists a procedure of getting rid of this malady. Is this procedure modified for the child or somehow performed in the future? That is the absence of attention to the spiritual of this.
So first of all, yes, God willing, when the Gemara or the Mishnah talks about saras, this is a question that's already been not brought up. It's already been drawn out from the context twice, which is again, what exactly is the procedure for cleansing a child from saras, which is a good question. I'm going to defer again to frustration, but I probably should have been careful. Maybe I wasn't. I meant less as a spiritual question and more as a halachic question. Not because saras does not have a spiritual concern, but the way the Gemara here is talking is very much a cut and dry halachic analysis. Once we determine that we're not going to remove the saras, and if we determine that it needs to undergo the protocols of saras healing, so then certainly there is a spiritual component, which then leads to Alan's question. And again, I'm not going to have an answer for it now, which is, Alan's not here, but God willing, he'll join us tomorrow, which is, from what we understand.
I have a question.
Hold on, what we understand from a superficial level about saras, why is it that a baby would get saras? And so, but that's again a question I'm not going to answer now. It warrants a deep dive into the laws of saras and about particularly pediatric saras, which again is I haven't yet researched. So whatever I'll tell you would not be very. It would be probably less helpful than me not saying anything more and keeping it a mystery for now. So So yeah, Ali, you were
Question? Yeah. So my question is, you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
I hear you.
Okay. Starting, the 8 days are coming, and the baby, and the mohel says that the baby's yellow. We gotta wait. Okay. Why can't we go ahead and go to another mohel and ask him the same question? Maybe he says, no, I can do it. He's fine.
Well, if one mohel says, I'm concerned for your baby's health, go heal first, and then a mohel wants to do the circumcision, that's enough of a reason I think I wouldn't want to go to that mohel. But anyways, we'll talk about this later, but not let's try to stay focused on the facet or the intersection of circumcision and saras as the Gemara presents it. But actually, I will tell you, we do have a recent anecdote where a child was brought to a certain mohel, and the mohel said, listen, based on the anatomy of the baby, I'm not comfortable doing the circumcision. For this, I suggest that you do it with a urologist who is a mohel, because this is a highly specialized and specific concern. And so they went to the urologist. And actually what happened is, in Florida, there isn't a pediatric urologist that's a mohel, but they were going to do it together. So the pediatrician would do the procedure and the mohel would be to oversee it. And the parents were actually very upset. So they went to another mohel.
And who says the bracha?
Hold on, listen to me.
Okay.
They went to the other mohel, and the other mohel told them the exact same thing. And in the end, when they went to the pediatrician, to the pediatric urologist, the urologist actually also said, I'm not. I also think the baby needs to grow a little bit before I could even operate. And so if there was a mohel that would say, I'll do it, probably he should be disbarred, not that you should go to him. So that's my I'm not a mohel expert, to be honest. I have several mohels in Florida that I would defer to with any mohel questions. So everything that I'm telling you is just from general knowledge. But that's how I would react if one mohel decides he knows more than two other senior mohels and a urologist. I would stay away from that.
Usually, when anybody gets a second opinion for anything, it's usually lekula and not lechumra.
Meaning, right?
Meaning, people look for a way out, not rather than
to avoid harm. You're saying, not to, right. Yeah. Doctor?
Yeah, I don't want to go into it too much. We could put it on the list, but what I think is very prominent among non-observant Jews is the feeling that it's safer to go, if you're going to have a baby circumcised, to do it in the hospital, because a doctor is more knowledgeable and can deal with all of these issues. And you don't want it to be where a mohel did something, chas v'chalila, that shouldn't have been done. So I want to put on our list to deal with that issue and to focus on, I know you're not going to like this, Mitzitza Bapeh, and the history there as one example of this.
Let's avoid that now, but for one simple reason, because the Gemara is going to drop that line in due time. So when we get there, God willing, we'll have a conversation with the important caveat that I am not an expert mohel, and I can't really handle blood, and so you don't want a mohel who freaks out the first time they see blood. I don't freak out, but it's not something that I particularly enjoy. All right, Amar Abaya. No, I'm sorry. Here, Blosser the Shama Mirava Savra. After Abaya heard Rava make the presentation, he said, "You know what? I like it. I agree with you." And so now, in a sense, Abaya and Rava would agree that this brisa is really talking universally to a case of sekresha v'layamos. According to both Abaya, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon, we need a pasuk. So we had a conversation between Abaya and Rava about the contribution of a brisa saying that the Torah explicitly says we push aside and away saras in the face of a bris, and you go ahead and do the bris and let that baheres fly a kite. We're not going to take that into account. There is another version of this conversation. This conversation was preserved, but there are those who preserve this conversation in a different context. Very related, but slightly different. says Hishomer b'nega atzaras lishmor ma'oid v'lasois. And we'll think Rabbi Sefaria for here. Hishomer b'nega atzaras lishmor ma'oid v'lasois. Guard. Be very careful. Be meticulous. In the instance of a tzaras. Kechol asher yoyru eschem hakoyanim halavim. Whatever the Levitical koyanim instruct you, kasher sivisim tishmeru la'asois. As I've commanded them, and they're going to inform you, that's what you should be careful to do. Koyanim halavim, an interesting reference.
Yeah.
Anyways, so there are those who had a tradition that Abai and Rabba had this conversation. Lasois. It says the word lasois, to do. Lasois iatois. Aval oisa. Let's read this all and then we'll read Rashi. Aval ata oisa b'siv shal gabe ragloi u'b'moit shal gabe kesefai. You cannot do it in a, and I think Rashi is going to say, asiya conveys intentionality. Let's read Rashi. Lasois oisa at. Basically, what he's saying, and then we'll read it. We'll look at Rabbi Steinsaltz for a precise translation. What he's saying is, you cannot proactively and with intentionality remove a tzaras, but if it happens along a different process, it could happen. It can be done with a pull on a leg. I'm sorry, with something on a person's foot, or if there's a pull on one's shoulder. Let's read Rashi. If you have a tzaras, you don't have to be super careful to never ever place something on it in case it rubs out or scratches off the nega. You cannot do it with intentionality, but if it happens in a different process, you're just minding your own business, carrying stuff for work, or taking on and off your shoes. If in that process of regular living, it becomes removed, well, that would be okay based on this pasuk. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz. It says, take heed with regard to the plague of leprosy, that you observe diligently and do it in accordance with all that the priests, the Levites instruct you, as I commanded them to take care of you. Them you shall take care of them. Chazal derive from here. What does it mean, lasois, to do? You may not do something to remove leprosy. If the doing is putting on cream to remove the, well, maybe, I don't know, or scratching off or filing down, you're doing with intentionality to remove the tzaras. But you may do something that will indirectly remove the symptoms, like tying a thick rope on his foot or placing a rod on his shoulder. I don't know if Rashi and Rabbi Steinsaltz have exactly the same interpretation. I have to go back and read Rashi. So you cannot do something directly, says Rabbi Steinsaltz, says the Gemara. But if you do something indirectly, that might be done. This is permitted even though there is a baheres, a bright white spot present. And if the bright white spot is removed, it's removed. Again, this is a bryce. Reading the verse, Yishamar b'negat tzaras lishmar b'v'lasois, talking about intentional doing. Intentional, no. Indirect, that's all right. Rashi and Rabbi Steinsaltz are different. Rabbi Steinsaltz is saying that you could intentionally do something that along the way, indirect. Rashi seems to be saying, not that you could do something to indirectly remove your tzaras. You can live life and you don't have to be consumed with the concern that maybe it'll be scratched out. So again, I think there's a nuanced difference between Rabbi Steinsaltz and Rashi. Of course, Rabbi Steinsaltz is likely teaching the Gemara based on a different commentary that fits the general context. The Gemara continues, hang on a second. Do I need a pasuk to teach me? Davar she'eino miskaven hu. He's not doing something intentionally to remove tzaras. V'davar shein miskaven mutter. And you're allowed to do something without kavana. Amar Abaye, and it's on this content, it's in this conversation that Abaye pipes up and says, this pasuk would be needed according to the way Rabbi Yehuda understands halacha. Amar davar shein miskaven us. Because Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't care, don't tell me your kavana maisis. You removed it, it's asur. So for a person who says, I don't care about intentionality, I would need a verse to tell me that you could do it here. Because usually kavana isn't relevant until the Torah made it relevant. So that's how Abaye explains it. Abaye says, Rabbi Yehuda says, I never care about kavana. I care about results. With the exception, says Abaye, of when the Torah tells us that what matters is kavana. Then, of course, we listen to the Torah. And we infer from the Torah that absence of kavana is not absent kavana, it's not prohibited. Rava disagrees with Abaye and says, no, afilu temer Rabbi Shimon. Rava says the Brisa and the Torah bringing a pasuk is needed even according to Rabbi Shimon, because although Rabbi Shimon generally says we look at intent more than actions, but in a case where it is impossible for the tzaras not to be removed, it is absolutely going to be removed, then Rabbi Shimon would agree that it is not allowed, absent a verse that talks about intentionality and direct. Doesn't Abaye know about the psik reisha v'layamos deal? The Gemara answer is Labasar. The Shama Mirabba Savra. He first heard it from Rava, and then he accepted it and embraced it as his own. And so to the point where Abaye and Rava started sending around joint messages around all the communities of Talmud students of the Mishnah and the Gemara to say, you know what? Shimon is moedeb sekreisha v'layamos. So as you note, the same format, the same conversation, but attached to a different saras kavana conversation. Maybe it happened twice. Now the Gemara is going to go back and try to understand Abaye's original mistaken notion. Before Abaye changed his mind, what was he saying? Ready for this? We're almost done. We're almost at the end of this discussion. Abaye Liba de Rabbi Shimon, Abaye, who earlier on said that the need of a pasuk to teach us that you can cut away a arla even if tzaras falls off. That was only according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says, I don't care about kavana. But Abaye says, Rabbi Shimon, it's all about kavana. And if you don't have kavana, of course you can cut off a foreskin and along the way remove tzaras. That's not your intent. So now there's an extra word basar, my avidly. That extra word basar, again, we're trying to understand how Abaye would have defended himself before he changed his mind, which is an interesting exercise. I suspect your Beryl would give me some pushback on this Gemara. Oh, he's not on yet. Okay. Right? Hi basar, my avidly. In his initial understanding, there's an extra word in the Torah. And what would he do with that word in the Torah? Rashi, Abaye Liba Rabbi Shimon, Me'ikara, originally. Mikame de Sabra, before he changed his mind. Hi basar, my avidly. Rav Amram said, you know what Abaye would say? You know what Abaye would say that Rabbi Shimon would say about the extra word? If he calls up the moyel and says, hi, I need you to do a double mitzvah. My poor baby has a tzaras, and I don't want him to have to undergo the common procedures. Could we kill two birds with one stone? Could you please cut off my baby's tzaras when you remove his arla? He didn't need to say that. But if he did, he showed us that his intention is the tzaras. So you could say the wrong thing and make it clearly about the tzaras. And then, is the moyel allowed to cut? Without the word basar, I would say no. And the word basar comes to tell us, I don't care if you had super kavana. Because kavana hin, kavana her, mila is stronger than saras. And you will always remove the foreskin even if there is saras around. I don't care how strong and explicit your kavana is. Let's read Rashi Vaymer Lakutz. Gadol. Yeah, fine. We're talking about an adult now. I said it was about a father and a son, but that's going to be the Gemara later. If a person says, "Hey, Mr. Moyel, I got a problem. I've got a tsaras, and by the way, I also need a bris. Could you do me 2 procedures? I'll pay you once." That sounds like this sounds like a Jew we know. So Gadol Shubar Einshiv Amar Lamoyel Lakrut Baharte Bekavana Litar. His intention is to remove the tsaras. If he said it, he shouldn't say it. So the Gemara says, Teinach Gadol, this is okay. I understand why we need the word basar in the context of an adult. But as you may recall, the Torah uses the word basar twice. Most babies can't talk. Most babies, even if they could talk, don't have kavanah. So my ikal meimar. So why would Abaye say that Reb Shimon needs the word basar? Obviously, we're talking about the father's talking on behalf of the son. Rashi katan. The loyada lechavni, babies don't have kavana. So my ikal meimar val korcha basrayu ksiv basar kedemir le'el basar dechsig v'avkatam yemashmin lamali. So again, basar teaches us that even if the father tells this the moyel, you got to make sure to cut in the right angle, the right direction. Get that. I know, Dr. Amory, I'm teasing your original question, but whatever. Make sure that saras comes off. So what do? Is the baby now no longer? Oh, who cares if the father said something? So just the father doesn't do the bris, you'll ask another person to do the bris. Whenever there is a positive and negative commandment, so you get another person to do the bris. The father had kavana, so he can't do the bris. You get somebody else. There's a workaround. Gemara says deleka acher. You'll ask another person. You don't tell him about the tsaras. Just say, "Hey, dude, see this baby? He's not getting his bris. How do you feel about that?" Say, "Oh, wow, I'm a mohel. Can I help?" Sure, go ahead. Deleka acher, but maybe there is no other mohel. And therefore, we need the Torah to tell us basar, even if the father messed things up by saying what shouldn't be said. He still does the bris, because it's not kavana that matters here. It's a general and total overpowering of the importance of Mila over Saras. My dear friends, this concludes this lengthy discussion about Saras and Shabbos. I'm sorry, Saras and but don't worry, we're not out of the bris kit. We're not out of the bris zone yet.
I have a question.
Ellie, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have a question. What happens if there's twins? One baby is good to go, questionable, and one baby is not good to go.
What would you say?
What do we do? So it happened to my boys.
What would you say?
My boys were premature. They were very small.
Okay.
The rabbi wanted to wait. The rabbi wanted to wait at least 2 weeks until they grew back their strength, and then they did the bris together.
Was that in order to accommodate the 2 babies together, or is it because they were following the general procedures for a premature baby?
I don't remember.
Generally speaking, if one baby is well and the other baby is not, they would do the bris on the baby that's well.
Correct.
A premature baby is discussed in halacha, and so a premature baby, you make sure that the preemie is strong and viable, in the words of the Gemara, and then you would do the bris. And of course, a premature baby, depending on how prematurely they're born, have different concerns or matters that need to be, or they need to be strengthened, or maybe the breathing needs to develop, or whatever, depending on the degree of. So of course we wouldn't circumcise on a baby until they're entirely independently viable and they don't need machine equipment or machinery or a constant intervention. So generally you'll wait, I believe, until the baby is discharged, or ready to be discharged, to determine that the baby's healthy. And we will, the Ezer Hashem, explore that as well. So we'll leave that at that. All right, so now we're going to start a new discussion. It's also going to be familiar to an extent. It's going to be a discussion about bris and yontif. So I don't know if you remember someone, maybe it was Dr. Hammer, maybe it was Reb Allen. I don't remember now. I'm sorry. But someone, maybe it was someone else, asked about yontif and bris. And I said, hold your horses. We're going to get there.
Wouldn't it be a kal vachomer?
Maybe, but that's an interesting question. So let's look out if that's asked. But at the very least, suffice to say, the Brisa lists yontif separately. And so now, when I said we're going to see, now is where we're seeing. Amar Mar, we read in the Brisa that gave us a discussion about when a bris pushes aside other things. So we already know bris bismana pushes aside Shabbos. We also know bris bismana and shaloi bismana pushes aside any kind of saras related concern. Again, supposing that it's doesn't have any effect whatsoever on the baby's well-being. Now let's talk. Yontif Yontif only is pushed aside for a timely bris. So Dr. Stamler, I think, you just said that it should be a kal vachomer for Shabbos. But maybe tell me why it would not exactly be a kal vachomer, why it needs its own discussion. Because Yontif, at least on a superficial level, Yontif is a more lenient. There are some leniencies in Yontif that do not exist on Shabbos. And so we're talking about being doicha. So maybe Yontif that's already more lenient, there's additional space for leniency, or maybe not. So Yontif kind of needs to have its own discussion. To be clear about when we do push aside Yontif for a bris and when we don't push aside Yontif for a bris. So the Brisa tells us, Yontif, you only do a Yontif tik bris if it's the 8th day. Amar Chizkiah, I'm sorry, how do I know? How do I know the halacha that bris pushes aside Yontif only bismana? So now we're going to start talking about carbonis, which are central to Yontif and Shabbos. Amar Kra, the pasuk states regarding Karban Pesach v'chein Tana de Bechizkiah. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Loi soisiru mimenu ad boker. Karban Pesach cannot be left over until the morning Rashi. No. She'ein Talmud Loimar ad boker. The Torah didn't need to tell us ad boker. How so? Let's go and open the psukim. Oh. Here is Exodus. And we'll read the whole thing. Remember this. Speak to the people and say, on the 10th of the month, take a carbon pesach. If the house is too small for a full lamb, you can partner up. What do you take? It's a lamb without a blemish, a year old, or a sheep or a goat. Guard it till the 14th day of the month, slaughter it, all the Jews in the evening, pick the blood, put it on the doorposts and on the mashke of the lintel. Eat it that night, it's roasted, don't eat it. Other forms of cooking, don't leave it over till the morning. But if you do leave something over, tis rightful. Don't leave it over, and if you leave it over. Now let's take a look. The Torah didn't need to say ad boiker. He could have said loy soisidu mimeno. Why? Because we know it's a nighttime karban. So matam aloymer ad boiker. So what's the need to specifically mention the morning? The Torah is actually giving more time to burn it. So there's a deadline for consumption. But here the word ad boiker actually teaches us another morning. Let's see this in Rabbi Steinsaltz. The verse has a superfluous ad boiker. Says it twice, right? Loisasidu mimenu ad boiker. The hanoiser mimenu be'esh desroifu. If you leave it over, we know that ad boiker is the deadline. So why 2 ad boikers? To give us another morning. Leftover meat from the carbon Pesach that's not burned, isn't burned, I'm sorry, on the first day of Yontif, which is Yontif. You wait until the next day, the first day of Chol Hamoed in Israel. Even though the labor of kindling a fire is not totally asur on Yontif, you could cook, but that cooking is only l'tzarich eichel nefesh, for food and preparing food and immediate needs, for things that don't need that cannot wait. Similarly, and we'll see this in Rashi too, since bris involves a molacha, it is only mutter on the 8th day when there's no option of postponing it. But otherwise, you cannot do it on Yontif. So again, we see that certain mitzvahs that are flexible could be pushed aside till after Yontif. Now let's read this. This is the explanation of Chizkiah. Now let's read Rashi. Tinyana, the second ad boiker, is extra. It didn't need to use the word until the morning twice. It's telling us when the fire should be. The stuff that's left over past the time that it's okay to eat, the Hanu Boiker Rishon, hold it, and wait till Chol Hamoed. Have a B'yantif loy, but don't do it on Yantif. Alma, midi dechol, loy avdina on B'yantif. We don't do non-Yantif to get things on Yantif. Upesach, carbon yudal b'nissen, shucho. The carbon Pesach is done on the weekday. It's prepared, it's cooked. It's still not Yantif. Umila shaloi bezmana, similarly, a not in time bris, midi dechol, it belongs. It should have been done not on Yontif. Because the Zman of the bris is not really on Yontif. It's meant to be earlier. And so once it's pushed off, it's pushed off. So from here we see that there's a precedent for holding off on certain non-Yontif tika activities if the mitzvah is not a Yontif mitzvah till Chol HaMoed. And so Chizkiah says, if I push off burning the carbon Pesach, you can also push off any bris that's not on time. Any act that belongs to not Yontif, waits till after Yontif. This is one source. Abaye says there's another pasuk. Oilas Shabbos b'Shabbatoi, oilas Chol Shabbos, oilas Chol b'Yontif. We say in the Torah description of the Tamid, the daily carbon. It's only, you only bring Yontif Karbonis on Yontif, you only bring Shabbos Karbonis on Shabbos, but all other facets, let's read Rashi, Evrei Tamid Shel Erev Yontif, the stuff that needs to be burnt, but it needed to be burned as a result of a pre-Yontif Karbonis, in Krevim B'Yontif, Umila Shalib Izmananami Koilas Chol B'Yontif Tami. To do a not timely bris would be to bring a carbon that's not in time. That's a second source. Now, if you're having some trouble appreciating the analogy between carbonis and bris, you're in good company with me. So, but let's first read them through. Let's get the different perspectives, and then we'll try to find if there's a greater explanation or something that we're missing that really makes them connected. So, again, we'll probably end up having that conversation next time we speak. But if you're feeling a little bit funny, don't feel bad. I'm with you. Rava Omar, hold on. We saw Chizkiah. We see Abaya's explanation. And we see Rava's explanation. And again, so far, all of their discussions have to do with carbonis that belong on Yontif being done on Yontif, and carbonis that don't belong on Yontif being deferred till after Yontif. And we're equating, in a sense, Mila, circumcision, to be like a carbon. If the 8th day since birth is Yontif, then it's a Yontif carbon, and you do it on Yontif. But if the 8th day was Erev Yontif, let's say, well, then what you're going to be doing on Yontif is not a Yontif carbon. It's not destined. It wasn't predestined, and therefore it's still not destined to happen on Yontif. And let's read the next. Okay, we'll go through this fast, and then we'll rejoin tomorrow at this point. Rava says, Omar Kra. There's a verse. Hu levado yeyasalachem. Exodus 12:16. The verse is describing the rites of Yontif of Pesach. On the first day of that Yontif, it is a sacred day. And on the seventh day, it's Yontif. Don't do any melacha, with the exception, what's to be eaten for a person, that may be done on Yontif. So again, on Yontif, on the first day, on the sixth day, don't do melacha, with the exception of oichel nefesh. It says, Hu levada yasalachem. That's all you can do. Who cooking, v'loy machshirim, but not the things that facilitate food. So, for example, you're not allowed to build an oven, or create a knife, or create a fork or a spit or whatever. Who? Only the food, only the act of cooking, not another malacha that would lead to cooking. Livado, exclusively, you can only do food. V'loimila shaloibis mana, but not an untimely bris. The asya mikal v'chaimer. Let's see, Rabbi Steindel's here. Oh, a Kal v'chaimer might have told us that you do push it aside. Therefore, the Torah says levade, don't do a late bris on Yontif. Rav Ashi Amar, Shabbason, it says that don't work. Shabbat Shabbaton, it's a day of rest. Yom Harishain, Mikra Kodesh, Yom Hashvi. No, where's the Shabbaton? Which pasuk is this? Well, anyway, we'll pull it up next time. Shabbaton asehu. It's a positive commandment. There's a positive chiyuv to rest. Yontif has a negative and positive aspect. What you do and what you don't do. And therefore, an untimely asay of Mila doesn't push aside Shabbos and Yontif. Rashi, the Mila doiche lo yisasav asay, avo bizmana it's Rabbi B'yoyim afilu Shabbos. All right, we need to revisit this tomorrow. So we're leaving a little bit on a cliffhanger of sorts, in that we're not entirely clear, certainly not of this last one. The Ezer Hashem tomorrow will clarify it. I just want to show you that we're now back to the Mishnah. So we've done well today, my dear friends. A big thank you, Yasher Koyach, to everyone that joined us. We give our prayerful wishes that BMA's flag football team is victorious today. They should make a Kiddush Hashem and show the value, the virtue of wearing a kippah and being proud of our flying, our colors. And also Amir Tashem on Thursday, Mark. It's going to be Barbara's father's yard site. Give us a preview.
Yes, Yitzchak ben Moshe.
Yitzchak ben Moshe. And so, Neshama Shem Aliyah. And again, prayerful wishes for good news, healthy news, happy news for our dear Chabur and all of Kalal Yisroel. Thank you all so much. Hope to see you tomorrow. Take care. Shkoyach.